Welcome, fellow enthusiasts of the unexplained, to Paranormal M. Subscribe and turn on notifications to join us as we unravel the mysteries of the paranormal. We guarantee a thrilling adventure filled with twists and turns that'll leave you wanting more. And drop a comment if you can. Helps us with the algorithm. Let's get started. Can someone help me find out what this is? And how to do it? So basically, my dad is 50, lived in South Africa till he was 17, and when he was about 13 or 14, him and his friends would skip school. They'd stay at his house whenever my nan and granddad were at work. One of his friends told him about this ghost thing, which was a rumor in school. He can't remember how it worked exactly, but it was something involving a book, a rubber band or elastic band, and a key, I think. All of his friends were in his room and the door was locked. They did the thing with the book and heard many, many loud bangings on the door. And after a while, they were obviously kind of shit scared and they went outside and there was a large scratch on the door that wasn't there before. Only noticeable if you were told it was there, but it was big. Does anybody know what the fuck this was? I've looked everywhere and I have no idea what this is or how it worked. I'm obviously not going to do it, but I want to know what it was and how it worked. My dad sounds genuine with this story. I want to know if anybody else has tried whatever this was and what happened to them. And what if the door wasn't unlocked? By the way, this is an edit because I changed my mind. It's probably for the best if you don't tell anybody how to do it. I'm assuming it was dangerous if it left a large scratch on the door and was banging on it. It was probably trying to get in. Scariest night of my life. First, I want to introduce myself. I'm a 20-year-old male from Serbia. This story happened around 6 or 5 years ago. That would be making me 14 or 15 years old. I live in the rural part of Serbia, but not rural enough to say anything can happen. It's just we're around 25 kilometers away from the nearest town. In Serbia, we have villages, which I live in. They aren't really villages, as most of the people from there work in some industry, and almost all of them have small gardens that they do on the side. But in a sense of number of people, it's not that much. So in a sense, it's rural, if you can imagine. So around that time, my close friend and I would ride bikes all day long and all night long. We were at that point everywhere everybody could have been, in a very large area. I'm just going to say we rode bikes for more than 50 kilometers every day for around a few years, except the winter, of course. So the story starts with us being bored on summer vacation. There's a tradition that almost all villages have football tournaments in summer, and it would take around 7 to 10 days to finish, depending on the number of teams that are submitted. So we already gone to number them, and nothing would be different than normal, because it was the road that we knew the people we knew it. It would just be normal stroll sort of a thing. So what we did is we would go around 6 p.m. It would take us around 40 minutes to get there. There were 2 options for how to get there. It's the main road that's a lot longer, around 30 minutes or more, because it was going around hills and forests. And at the second road that was going through forest. We chose the one through the forest, not because we were fearless or anything like that, but it was for safety reasons. The main road had asphalt, but not lights. We didn't have lights on our bikes. We would always get lost since we rode bikes off-road. And a lot of heavy trucks use that road, and it would be easy for them to kill us. So we chose the second road with thinking that because we don't have any dangerous wildlife, we thought it would be safest. The story goes like this. We go a few times and nothing weird happens. While nothing happened, I want to describe a road to you. From my house to my friend's house, it was a main road. We lived around 5 minutes from each other on bikes, of course. It's a small downhill from my house to his, and from his house you'd have to kind of go on another main road to another neighboring village, and that road is like a very big downhill, and that's close to his house. Then we pass a church. The church is on a bit of flat part of the hill, and then another downhill up the bridge on a small stream, and from there it's a big uphill to a neighboring village. From there it was a flat ride until we would change road to a rural part, and this road was used by tractors. So it would look like this. I'll put the link somewhere. Sorry guys, we can't see it. Of course, this is not the location, it's just a picture that could resemble the one. Then we would go downhill past the little stream, go steep uphill, and from that part it would be flat for around 3 kilometers. There was no forest on that flat part. It was just fields of wheat and corn. But from the downhill was only very thick forest, which was like the link to the right of the forest and uphill. But left was a steep downhill to a stream, even more than the link. The downhill was very long, like 7 kilometers. And then we would come across our first houses of our destination. During the day, not scary at all. Even I would say it's a beautiful road, which we used before our rides, and this road was very much known from us from a long time ago. A few details: there's a lot of headstones on this road because a lot of people died there while falling down trees. Okay. And a few graveyards were on that road, but we were never scared of it. There were a few stories around the bridge between our village and the first neighboring village where we passed the church. Stories were usually a drunk man would disappear and they'd find him a few days later all bloody and scratched. He would say that some creature was on his shoulders and was choking him. But you can imagine how those stories from a drunk man may seem false. So that was all the description for situation and environment. Now what happened. When tournament started, the moon was full, and we could see everything without lights. And while going home, we would hear all their animals all around us. Some are howls, crickets, foxes, dogs in the village, and so on, even though we were going home every night around 1 to 2 a.m. But something changed when it started getting darker. First, we started hearing steps behind us, and around 10 meters away at first, and we're off the road, so we thought it was some animal. But we checked a few times, but there was nothing there except, I would say, a chasm. Because if you fell, it would be hard to come back up. I can even say that if you did fall, and didn't hit any tree while falling, you would fall directly on rocks and probably die. So we came home, didn't think much of it. Then as there was less and less light, the steps became closer and closer. I'll skip a few nights because nothing happened as we were talking to try not to get scared. The last night was hell. Before we got out of the village, my friend stopped me and said this to me. Whatever you do, do not look behind us tonight. If you see something, do not pay any mind. Just go your way, and if you feel scared, pray, and everything will be all right. He at that time already read a Bible a few times and was a believer. I was a believer too, but I never really given it much thought. Like I believed because of tradition, so I said to him, everything will be fine either way, but I will do as you say. I believed in my friend because he never lied to me, even though we knew each other for around 10 years. We then started going uphill to get home, and this way took us around an hour and 30 minutes to get back because now all downhill when we came was uphill. From the moment we stepped out of the light, what was behind up now was like a meter behind us. We could feel it. All we knew was that something big and heavy, and it sounded like it had hooves. The feeling was like that of a large cow being behind us, but it didn't have 4 legs. It had a weird rhythm like it was walking on 2, but the ground was shaking with each step. When I say shake, I mean it would feel like vibrations clearly. We were frozen solid even though it was 30 degrees Celsius outside and everything was quiet except the steps. There were no animals, no insects, no dogs, no nothing. That thing was following us around 1 hour nonstop. And that hour was like years. Even if I wanted to, I couldn't have looked back because I was so scared. All we did was walk in silence. We didn't let any sound, not even breathing, being as quiet as the night when we finally got into the first village. We were white and cold to the touch, while everything else was warm. We then got to one public water faucet, washed our faces and hands because we wanted to get some of the heat on us. Then we sat under streetlight for around 20 minutes to get us normal again. We were so happy that we were the first of all alive that we just started going for one last part. That's that road where the bridge is up ahead of the church. Before we left the last streetlight, my friend told me, "Listen, now is the hardest part. The bridge is turning point. If we see something or anything, this is the plan. We're going downhill and don't stop even if you can't pedal no more. Don't stop until you reach the church. If I'm not there, go to the church immediately. If you see something on the way down, don't pay any attention and just go your way. After that, when we, if God allows us, we will meet before church. We'll go together if anything goes down." I just nodded and we get to where we're going side by side. Saw nothing. We crossed the bridge, stopped before the church because we couldn't have pedaled anymore. We looked at each other, started going ahead. When we took a step to be before the church's gate, we heard a sound which I can't imitate or describe coming from the bridge. It was a sound that sounded like 100 people screamed and talked at the same time for around 20 seconds. We just looked at each other, looked behind, nothing was there. We slowly got uphill, we separated. And with the speed of light, we separated and got home. My parents were sleeping. I just opened their door and said that I got home. And when they saw me from waking up first thing, they asked, "Why are you so white?" I explained. They shook their heads and said that it was for going through the forest at 2 a.m. I'm lucky I didn't saw anything. I didn't sleep that night. And the next day, I needed to ask my friend what happened to know I was crazy, but he described everything as I remember. So we just sat down and we were like, well, we are alive, so that's good. A few weeks passed, and I was for some reason going on that road alone. Also at night, but around 11 p.m. alone. And nothing like that happened. Later, we also got together and also nothing happened, so we used that road a bunch more times and nothing's ever happened like that. I don't know how to end this story, but that was it. Even if it isn't anything grand and nothing actually happened, it's the scariest thing I've lived through. I believe God helped us. We were praying while walking and that demon was behind us. Believe is weak word, I want to say. I know God helped us and that demon was behind. When someone tells me they don't believe in God, but there is something, I tell them this story and say to them. I was thinking similar to you before that happened. And I don't want for anyone to go through that, just for confirmation that there's God and demons, not something. We have to give this guy leeway, because he's from Serbia, and this is his second language, so hopefully you guys got that. Demon or just delusion? Okay, so I grew up having multiple paranormal experiences, which I'm sure I'll post more of them. My mom grew up messing with paranormal games and spirits, so I feel like in a way she kind of screwed me over. The one I'm talking about now is about 4 years ago. I was in my room about to go to sleep. I was turning off my lamp, since I can't sleep with any light on, and that was set in the corner of my room. I was facing the lamp and had just turned it off all the way as darkness filled the room when I heard my name being said, almost drawn out in a dark voice like, think of your basic demon voice you make when you're trying to impersonate one. At first, I assumed it was my brother trying to scare me. I turned around to confront him. When I turned, there was no one there. The only person in the room was me. I quickly exited my room and checked my parents' and brother's room, who were all either sleeping or occupied, and wouldn't have been able to make it back to what they were doing without me catching them. I ended up just going to sleep thinking I was just hearing things. The next night, only 24 hours later, I was going to bed again and turning my lamp again. There was no voice, and I honestly forgot about it. Anyway, about 5 minutes later, I was covering myself with blankets when I swear on everything, a figure started crossing my room horizontally from me. He looked like if a member of the Blue Man Group was painted black. Crossed my room, paused for a second, side-eyed me so subtly. His eyes were brown, but the white around his eyes were purest white. It was unsettling. After pausing for a second, he continued crossing the room before he just disappeared. I was in shock, but decided not to wake anyone because I didn't want to disturb. I decided to sleep in the living room with the TV on, but it was too uncomfortable. Ended up returning to my room and just falling asleep. Never saw the man again, although I saw different entities. I didn't get an evil vibe from him, but it was unsettling and uncomfortable. To this day, I wonder what I saw. Still gives me chills to think about. Fun fact, that bedroom is still my room, and I'm typing this in there right now. Guest in the bathroom. As it happened sometime last year, but as it was happening, the sheer terror I felt at the time was truly unlike any other. I had met her so unexpectedly while I was spending the weekend over at my grandparents' house in the mountains in Indonesia. She was my first ever first-hand encounter with the otherworldly, and she chose to appear when I least expected it, at a place I was so familiar with even though I could remember. She was an uninvited guest who welcomed herself into my grandparents' home, a guest that nobody knew about but me. So the story goes, on my first night there at around 2 a.m., finally felt sleepy enough to sleep, so I decided to go to the bathroom just right across the room I was staying at to pee, before heading off to bed. The hallway was dark, but nothing felt weird. It was a familiar sight, and I sensed no danger or threat, so I just walked right into the bathroom to quickly do my business. Again, nothing felt out of the ordinary. Everything was as it usually is, until I opened the bathroom door to return to my room, and that door flung back on its own, shutting it again. That was the moment I knew I was fucked. Immediately, the bathroom lights started flickering non-stop, reminiscent of a club, but in the most horrific way considering my circumstances. Without much of a thought, I looked over my shoulder because I felt a presence, and sure enough, there was a girl at the back of the bathroom, completely motionless. However, what's weird was that I couldn't really make out her full form, if that makes sense. Or even her face, because strangely enough, she appeared to be quite blurry, although she was within close proximity, which was probably for the better. At a quick glance, I was only able to tell that she had a disheveled hair, and also that her body frame was, well, she was visibly very thin, skinny, even under that bloodied and tattered long white dress she had on. Then it sunk in again. I was locked inside of a haunted bathroom with a female ghost covered in blood standing still beside me while the lights are flickering. For maybe a good minute or two, that felt like an eternity at that. I was frantically trying to open the door in a state of panic to no avail, mind you, all while I was screaming at the top of my lungs, desperate for help for an entire time, but unfortunately, both of my elderly grandparents have hearing problems. My grandpa especially is pretty much gone deaf. So, I know, all that ruckus still wasn't loud enough to wake any of them up. I was going insane while the other two human beings in the house were sound asleep. For a second, it felt like I was on the verge of fainting due to shock, and the sudden surge of fear that took over my body simply because these things, the supernatural, scares me down to the core. And Indonesia happens to be one of those highly superstitious and quote-unquote active countries with the creepiest ghost species. Although, I can also feel myself shaking and my legs getting weak. The adrenaline was stopping me from fainting. To which would have been preferable, considering I could have just woken up the next day and started being in denial, but no. I just had to stay awake the entire time and have the very vivid recollection of everything. Anyways, as soon as the door finally opened, I sprinted back into my room. I just could not believe it myself. I made it back, kind of managed to escape alive and, well, completely unharmed, only traumatized. However, even if that was the case, I still could not even get a wink of sleep that night because I was frightened at the idea that she might have followed me in and, thereby, continue to haunt me again. Thus, I decided to spend the entire night hiding under the covers so I won't catch sight of her. Even if in that case, ignorance is bliss, right? When morning came, I set out to search for a fellow resident whom I've always thought was the bravest and most experienced on this topic. He lives in a separate building, a very haunted one, far away from the main house. To maybe look for some possible explanations. It was one of my grandparents' longtime workers. After I told him about what had happened last night, he told me that he'll look into it, try to figure out who she was. Not gonna lie, I really just thought what I saw was the Indo ghost called Kuntilanak, solely from its appearance. The classic long black hair, white bloody dress, and nothing else. Fast forward to the next day. To my surprise, he had news for me already. He told me that apparently after asking around the area, discovered that just recently, sometime around last week in fact, there was a young lady, a motorcyclist who was unfortunately involved in a deadly accident that killed her on impact. In a gruesome manner. Her head got sort of crushed. Along the road of where my grandparents' house was situated on, too. My heart sank. Could that be her, the girl I saw that night? But why the fuck would she be here of all places? Okay, so this is where it gets a little bit icky because a paranormal is now involved. After I told my highly superstitious dad about all this. Apparently, according to my dad's long-time trusted paranormal, yeah, this kind of is a thing in Indonesia. Kind of like how each family has their own family doctor, and this man is my family paranormal. Though I've always thought he's full of bullshit ever since I was a kid. They had managed to communicate with her. He basically confirmed what my grandparents' worker had told me. Additionally, as a result of her very sudden death, she was unable to rest in peace. Moreover, move on to the next stage following death, to her afterlife. Hence, she resorted to showing herself to me, albeit forcefully, which was apparently her way of seeking help. My help that night. Forgot exactly why or what she wanted me to help her with, but I seriously don't know why it had to be me of all people within the vicinity. In the end, the paranormal decided to just pray for her, and he either said she was moved out of my grandparents' property by him or was able to move on to the afterlife with the assistance of his prayer. I can't remember because it's been at least a half a year since it happened, but either way, he said he feels bad for her and pities her, so we decided to lend her a helping hand. Afterwards, that paranormal kept reassuring us that she was no longer at my grandparents' house, and that he's reinforced the prayer wall barrier, quote unquote. And this is something that was surrounding the main house area that was weakening. Yes, you read all that right. He apparently puts up prayer wall barriers and seals the area, preventing ghosts and spirits that are not blood related to my family lineage from entering. And this is in every single one of my dad's properties too, even the ones overseas. But because that was how she was able to breach those wall barriers and enter it through a gap, and, well, to be honest, all I care about is the fact that she's gone. Never tested, nor have the means to even do a test anyway, at least of his skill, ability, powers, or legitimacy. However, that was something that I chose to believe without question in order to give myself some peace of mind. Besides my family members, I seriously couldn't care any less even if all that shit was made up about all that paranormal. As long as she's out and never to return. End of story. Honestly, as I'm recounting all this again in great detail for the first time in months to write this post, on second thought, I think I'll for sure be traumatized for life. All because it's been, as I said, several months, and the memory of physically being in that locked bathroom with her takes me right back. And this is enough to send chills up and down my spine again and again. I wish I could say that I was hallucinating at the time or something, but I didn't. And I've had to live with this sort of chilling memory in my head ever since. From this time onward, I've been refusing to spend another night at my grandparents' house whenever I visit Indonesia. As much as I cherish that place and spending time with my grandparents at their own home. However, I just can't get over my trauma and paranoia, and it truly is a shame. But it is what it is. Running in the hallway. When I was 18 years old, I had this ex who I would visit often at his trailer home. He was still living with his parents and his younger siblings at the time, and on this particular day, his family was out of the house for some event. So we were the only ones in the home. Now I have to explain the layout of the home in order for you to understand why this kind of messed us up so bad. It was sort of like a rectangle. In order to go to his room, you'd have to walk down this little narrow hallway. We were just hanging out in his room watching TV. I was laying on the bed while he was on the floor for some reason. Can't remember too well. I was starting to fall asleep. That's when I see him turn his head toward his bedroom door. I asked him if he heard something. He shushed me. He then tells me that he thought he heard something, but then continued doing what he was doing. He then joined me on the bed. We just laid there watching TV. I see my ex perk up again and sits up on the bed. I muted the TV and was trying to listen to whatever he kept hearing. I heard creaking, like someone was in the living room walking around. We assumed that his family got home, so we just continued to watch whatever show was on at that time. As soon as I was about to unmute the TV, we heard running. You know how in scary movies there's always the scene when you hear that phantom running toward them? That's what it felt like in that moment. The running footsteps get louder and louder, each step sounding like whoever was running was digging their feet in order to mark it. We were just in the room looking at each other, just waiting for someone to burst through the door. The running then came to a stop once they reached the door. Sounds kind of silly, but believe me, we were fucking terrified. Just the way it sounded, each step getting louder and louder, the way you were able to feel the vibrations coming off of it. My ex then asked me if I had heard that. I nodded yes, but tried to cover it up with a lame excuse, saying, "Oh, maybe he's coming from the trailer next door." I didn't want to admit to him that I was scared shitless. I went home a little after that happened and got a text from him. He texted, "Do you really think that came from the other trailer?" I texted him back and told him, "I'm sorry, I admit it. I did hear it. It scared the shit out of me. That's why I left." Nothing like that ever happened again during the time we were together. We did mention that a couple months later that we were working on something underneath the trailer. He and his dad ended up finding remains. They called the police to pick them up. They came and never heard anything back since then. A growl from hell. When I was around 16 or 17, I had to share a room with my younger sister. I was very thankful I shared this room with her. We always heard some of the weirdest noises. Either that, or we would have some crazy nightmares that felt so real, and that's why I wanted to share this encounter. It was around summertime. We used to leave the windows cracked open to let the cool breeze in. It was late at night, maybe close to midnight. At that time, I enjoyed putting on MTV to fall asleep to. Something about hearing music late at night just helps you ease into your slumber. Anyway, I'm just watching the music videos they were playing on the TV when my sister and I hear this gut-wrenching, deep, hateful growl outside by our window. That scared the absolute shit out of us. We literally grabbed each other and asked ourselves if we both heard it. I can't even begin to explain how terrifying that growl was. That was my stomach, and a bird. Sorry. That growl is the stuff you hear in movies, but even then it sounded just so unbelievably real. My sister and I tried to come up with a reasonable explanation as to what it could be, but we couldn't find one. It couldn't have been a dog. The way it growled was just too deep for a dog to do. Needless to say, we stayed up all night until finally we saw daybreak, then passed out from the exhaustion. Has anyone ever experienced or heard something like this? I'm telling you, this wasn't normal, nor did it feel safe, and I'm 28 now and still remember clearly how disturbing that growl sounded, and what it made us feel that night. White cryptid creature. I'm 23 now. This happened sometime when I was in high school. I'm thinking around 11th or 12th grade. I lived at home at that time, and by my house were two elementary schools separated by some forest, joined together by a paved bicycle/walking trail through said forest. It was nighttime. My best friend at that time and I were out walking the trail from one school to another. To paint a good picture of what this trail was like, for some reason there were only like streetlights at the end of the trail where you'd be entering school property. The trail itself was pitch black, almost making it super eerie at night. Anyways, my buddy and I were coming around a bend just outside of where the first school was, and where there was a light. But as we approached the bend in the trail, we made it to a point where the light was barely letting up the trail anymore. I was walking with my head down, looking at my phone. My friend was just a few steps ahead talking, when out of nowhere he stops and goes, "The fuck is that?" Naturally, I stopped too, and at first I don't see anything. Caught up to where he was, and he takes a few steps ahead of me and he said, "Look over there in the bush, that white thing." Now, when I saw this thing, I absolutely froze. Sitting at the side of the trail off the pavement in this trail in the tall grass was this hunched over, super pale white thing. It looked like a person who was super skinny to the point where I could see its spine, bones, and rib cage. At first, I thought, well, maybe it's a crackhead. But it almost looked more like a dog without a tail or hair. When we first saw it, it had its back to us, and then turned towards us. It looked like a bald, pale, naked white man with absolutely no hair, severely undernourished and sunken-in eyes and super long arms moving towards us on all fours like an animal. We didn't even say a word to each other. We just both immediately started running the opposite direction to get home. We nearly sprinted the entire way back, which was like 1.5-ish kilometers. We told my parents when we got home, and the next day in the daylight, of course, my mom and I went back to where my friend and I saw this thing. And sure enough, right where we saw it, a bunch of packed down long grass as if something were sitting there or laying there. I actually messaged this friend who witnessed it with me. I was writing this and he still remembers it clear as day. And the fact that it looked almost like a creature mixed with a human. We have no clue what it was. I was wondering if anybody on here has a similar story. Thanks for the read. Cheers. Cheers back to you. Ghost/paranormal experiences. My own and from people I know. Jane and John lived together in a home with their daughter Laura. Jane and John would always be hearing things. Laura would always be seeing things. The fire alarm would always go off in the middle of the night. Every night after Laura went to bed, after Jane had read her a story, and after she'd sort of heard her parents get into bed, she'd always get up to get a glass of water from the bathroom. She remembers one night listening for her parents to get into bed, then getting up, opening her door to see that it was daylight. She looked and saw John standing in his bedroom doorway, and he tells her good morning. She stood there, confused as hell, because to her, no time had passed. She'd just honed to bed about 30 seconds earlier. The day just went along as usual. Laura would always see dark figures bolting past doorways. She'd even try to chase them. Whenever she saw them, she'd run after them and not find anything, and then run and tell Jane and John that she saw dark Sidious. And we'd run across the doorway. Jane and John believed her, because they too had seen similar. But they told her it was just her eyes playing tricks on her in order to keep her calm. Jane would get up for work at 6 in the morning every weekday. One morning she saw a figure standing under the tree in their front lawn. It was glowing faintly blue, and it was wearing a long white cloak. It was tall, had an elongated face, and appeared to be mumbling something. She stared right at it for a good minute, walked to her car briskly, not breaking eye contact with it. Once she was in her car, she calls John, told him to come out and see it. He came out and saw nothing. He wasn't in any disbelief. However, as he'd also experienced strange things in that house. One night... Sorry, I'm so starving that I'm messing up. One night, they were sitting in the living room at night. They were sharing a bottle of wine, watching TV. In unison, their eyes followed a black figure which passed swiftly by the windows. First the kitchen window, then the back door. They both saw it, looked at each other, confirming that they were both indeed seeing what they were seeing. John would also hear footsteps sliding across the carpet in the basement, especially while home alone. John frantically ran around the house one day because he could hear a tap running. I don't know whether or not he had found the running tap, nor does he remember this specific instant. Yet, when John was small, his grandmother passed away. Some days after her death at her funeral, he asked her to come and visit and to move some things in his room. If he happened to be asleep. Okay. Later that night, while John was asleep, he opened his eyes only for a moment to see a small Garfield figurine floating past his bedroom window. He'd assumed it was only a dream when, sure enough, when he woke up, the figurine was sitting right there in his lap. He still had the figurine and keeps it safe to this day. The same night John's grandmother passed, his sister Bethany was visiting by her grandmother in a dream. Her grandmother told Bethany that she was very cold. When Jane's father, Eric, passed away, her cousin Vera had a dream. During Vera's childhood, Eric was like a father to her. Vera dreamt that Eric had come to visit her, to comfort her. The next day, Vera called Jane to ask if everything was all right with Eric, received the news of his passing. While driving to Eric's funeral, Jane, John, and Jane's sister Nancy and her husband Daniel were in the car. Jane was driving. The highway was extremely icy, and it was snowing heavily. Jane, devastated by her father's passing, was crying, was unable to see the road clearly through her teary eyes, and all that snow. Suddenly the volume on the radio began to increase, slowly, to an almost deafening level. Then slowly it came back down. When Jane and Nancy were small, Eric would do this to the car stereo while driving if Jane and Nancy were making too much noise in the back seats, distracting him. At first, Jane had thought either John or Daniel had the stereo remote and were just playing some sick joke. But the remote was tucked away in the glove compartment. Jane felt comfort knowing her father was still there to protect her from danger. Some years later, Eric's brother Mark passed away. Jane, John, Nancy, Daniel, and Laura attended. While at the funeral, John felt an extremely strong and evil presence, as if there were something threatening or attacking Mark. John believes he has a very strong connection to his past lives and the spirits he encountered. When John was an infant, he would often cry out at night, as most babies do. His parents, Rose and Bob, brought him to a temple to have the demons removed from him. After the temple visit, he never cried out at night again. John believes he had been crying out at night because of his past life. In his past life, he was a monk. He believes that he had evil spirits trapped within him because of this, and that those spirits were removed upon his visit to the temple. Daniel's father passed recently, and while visiting his father's house shortly after he passed, he noticed that the clock in the kitchen had stopped the exact moment he died, and a yellow canary watched him through the window of every room he entered. When Jane was starting her career as a nurse, she worked in a nursing home. An elderly woman on her deathbed had not had the strength to speak or move for an entire week. Then one day while Jane was in the room with her, she sat up, asked for a glass of water. She then looked up into the corner of the room and had the warmest smile on her face. Jane asked her what she was looking at. The woman told Jane she was looking at the Virgin Mary. The woman was in total bliss. Jane brought her a glass of water and she succumbed to her old age within an hour. Laura's close friend Jonas unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago. Jonas had taken his own life in the basement of his home. For the months after Jonas's death, Laura had been receiving silent phone calls from Jonas's number. She'd pick up the phone and hear silence before the call ended. She'd also hear more of Jonas's favorite songs on the radio, or they would shuffle more frequently in her playlist. These were songs that would often be sung over the phone, and these occurrences stopped about 5 months after Jonas's death. In Laura's current home, not childhood home, she had seen lights turning on by themselves, items mysteriously falling off shelves and doors closing on their own. To Laura, these occurrences are not frequent enough to be considered a haunting, She believes they are simply spirits passing through the area, not intending to cause any harm, and not staying in her home. My boyfriend talks in his sleep. This is an actual true story about what happened in December. I didn't think about posting the story here until just now, but here I am, and I'm sharing it. For the sake of anonymity, places and names will be switched out. My boyfriend and I have been together for over 2 years now. When this occurred, we've been living together in an apartment for almost a year. I'm going to refer to him as John and myself as Jane. One thing about my boyfriend is that he is, I wouldn't call him psychic or medium, but both him and some of his family have the ability to feel presences. Something that no one can see or hear but him, and some of his other relatives can just notice. This was prevalent a lot in the first apartment that we lived in, as the place was quite an odd one. John would feel some type of energy in the apartment every now and then. Since I'm a person who can get quite spooked, I quickly told him to save the stories of the presences he could pick up until we had moved out of there. Kindly enough of him, he did. John has shared some of the details after we moved away from there. They were pretty creepy, in my opinion. When we then moved into our current apartment that was built pretty recently, John could confirm that he did not feel any of those energies in there. I was relieved by this, as I'm sure you can understand. Another thing about John is that he talks in his sleep. It happens about once a week as far as I'm aware of. I'm a pretty heavy sleeper, but I can sometimes wake up by him talking nonsense or giggling out of nowhere. It's usually just a sentence, if even that. Sometimes it's just a word, maybe two. I've tried several times to record him in his sleep, but so far no luck in that plan. With all of this information shared, let me tell you the story that, brought me to write this in the first place. In the beginning of December, me, John, and my dad had decided to visit my grandma. Hadn't seen her for quite some time. She lives about 2-hour drive away from us. My grandma has this doll. She's called Rebecca. It's a regular plastic doll with blonde hair. It's about the size of a small child. When growing up, my dad would tell me these stories of Rebecca the doll. Ouch. Stories about her making things and moving places when he was home as a kid, but I had, of course, shared these stories with John. He'd laugh at them. As a woman of her early 20s, I wouldn't say that I was scared of Rebecca. Not even sure if I believed the stories that my dad told me. But having seen a lot of horror movies, many of them containing dolls, I have grown a respect for Rebecca. No need to provoke her, just to stay on the safe side. When visiting my grandma, I of course needed to show John the doll. She's placed in the corner of my grandma's bedroom, so me and John went in there, and out of nowhere John decides to flip his finger at Rebecca. I instantly felt panic and told John to apologize to Rebecca, just to be on the safe side. John says no, laughed it off, left the room. I quickly followed. I didn't want to be left alone in the room with that doll, especially after what had just happened. We returned home that same night, neither of us talking about the doll for the rest of the day. I'd honestly forgotten about it already since we were also decided to visit my cousins who lived in the same town as my grandma. Me and John went to sleep around midnight. Despite being a heavy sleeper, my boyfriend falls asleep before I do most nights. And this happened that night as well. I remember that I was about to fall asleep, but John nudged me with his elbow as he was looking for me. He said, "Jane," several times. Gave up on ignoring him and asked him what he wanted. "What are you doing?" he said. I asked him what he meant. "Are you standing there in the corner?" he responded. I instantly got chills down my spine. "What do you mean?" I asked back. "Yes, you're there in the corner. Why are you staring at me?" he replied. The room was pitch black. If there indeed was someone standing in the corner of that room, there's no way either of us could have seen it. "No, what are you talking about? I'm laying next to you," I responded, terrified at this point. "All right, okay," he said. Then he was quiet again, sleeping heavily. I felt ridiculous taking my phone and pointing the flashlight toward the corners of the room. Of course, I wouldn't see anything, but just knowing that my boyfriend had felt something with us in the room was enough for me to barely get any sleep that night. When waking up the next morning, John had no recollection of what had happened during the night. When I told him, he laughed at me and apologized for ruining my sleep. At first, I thought he was lying. The whole thing had been a prank, just to scare me, perhaps. But John is a terrible liar, and I know he was honest about him having slept through the whole thing. For Christmas, we went back to my grandma. I went back into her bedroom and I apologized to Rebecca on behalf of John, myself. Nothing similar has happened since. I've shared this story to friends and family, all who have thought it was pretty funny. I can't shake the feeling that it was actually the presence of Rebecca in our bedroom that night, that we had apparently upset, and maybe she followed us home. Two demons across the street. This was years ago. I may have been 16, may have been 17. But while I was visiting my mother in Virginia Beach, I was sitting on the couch watching TV doing nothing, just enjoying myself. It was late at night. As I'm sitting on the couch, I had this very strong feeling someone or something was watching me. And at the same time, the feeling let me know it wasn't a good presence at all. I tried shaking it off, thinking it would pass, but it didn't. It was like it wanted me to know it was there. So, eventually I got up, walked over to the window, looked between the blinds and the standing across the street. There were two demons staring back at me. As I stood there trying to wrap my head around what I was looking at, I will never forget what they looked like. Two demons wearing all black with a black cloak on with the hood over their head. One had burning all red eyes and the other burning green eyes as they just stood there smirking at me as if asking to come outside or letting themselves be known that they were watching me. I could barely make out the complete face because it was dark, but I was able to see some of it, and it definitely wasn't human. Needless to say, I was paralyzed with fear. But once I was able to move, I thought to myself, let me go get my sister to justify what I'm seeing, or hopefully they'll be gone by the time I come back to the window, or she can tell me I'm hallucinating. I ran into my sister's room, begging her to come into the living room with me, and of course she felt like I was annoying her, because I wouldn't tell her what I wanted, but she did finally agree to follow me to the living room. I told her to look out the window. She had this annoyed look on her face and said, fine. But when she looked, her whole expression changed after a couple of seconds of her looking. She asked me, Are those two demons? Craziest night of my life. Hi. To put some preface on this story before I get into it. I'm a Division I football player that plays offensive line. For those that don't know what that is, I'm basically saying I'm a big dude. Currently about 6'5", 300 pounds. Basically saying I haven't really been scared of animals or people where I live because I'm genuinely just bigger than them. Now, it was a late night after my high school basketball team at the time, and they had made the playoffs. I was currently on the phone with my girlfriend at the time as I was pulling into my country neighborhood in a small road in Alabama. It was around 12:31 a.m. I was pulling into the neighborhood and I see this woman with long black hair wearing like a Civil War period dress. It wasn't very weird for me to see random kids around my neighborhood because, well, I live near a foster home. But what freaked me out at first is that it was January or February, and at this late at night it was freezing. I pull into my neighborhood, I had to drive past her, slowly going about 3 p.m. past this woman. Maybe 3 miles an hour. Past this woman. I really didn't know what to do as I passed. She was still just staring at the ground. As I checked my rearview mirror, her head snapped up, and I saw an extremely evil-looking face. I hung up the phone and was going about 65 to my house. As I mentioned, I'm a big dude, and when I arrived at my house, I sprint up my porch stairs and into my room. Me being my size, that woke everyone in my house up. My dad enters my room to check on me, and me telling him everything that's happened. He asked if I was on anything. I told him of course I wasn't. He told me to get some sleep, and of course I couldn't sleep. It popped in my head and I had a Latina neighbor that was very close, and they had long jet black hair. Instantly I snapped her on Snapchat saying, "That was a good prank that you got me." She said she wasn't even in the state, didn't know what I was talking about. She sent me her location on the snap map showing me that she was in Baltimore. That was it. No chance I was getting any sleep that night. Hopped on Xbox to tell all my friends about the events that just occurred too. Of course, they didn't believe me, saying I was joking, and I told them how serious I was, though. At the end of the Xbox session, it was like 4 a.m. I'd gotten off and was going to try to sleep. Went to my bedroom, and as I was walking past the blinds, there she was, standing there in one street light in my neighborhood. I slammed the curtain shut, peeked again. She was gone. I have no idea what happened or what was going on that night. My dad and little brother have claimed to see the same woman years later in their own different stories. Scariest Night of My Life, Follow-Up Family Stories and Research, Part 2. What's up, y'all? I'm excited to see y'all all got to read my encounter. I never thought how many people would see it. Since my encounter, I've now moved to college to play football, as I've mentioned earlier. And now that I've left my brother as well as my dad, they've had encounters with a similar character to the one that I had seen. I've also done some research, and I'll get into that as well. Brother. One night, I would say a year ago, my brother was packing up around 10 p.m. to go to a baseball tournament in Atlanta the next day. As he was loading up the car, he heard a noise. And this noise sounded like a woman far away in the woods. He thought it was our neighbors or something. My brother finished putting the last bag in the back of the car, and then he looks in our driveway and sees the woman fitting the description of my encounter standing there. My brother isn't small either, had made fun of me for the way I'd acted when I had my encounter. Anyways, as he saw the woman standing there, she did the same thing. You couldn't see her face because of her long jet black hair. He said that he said hello and are you okay? She said and did nothing. She snapped her head up, and he said he saw a horrible looking face. He sprinted up through the porch and locked the doors. He peeked out the window and she was staring back. When he peeked back, she was gone. Father. This one isn't long, but it's still an encounter. My dad works around the country because of his job and finds himself coming home late sometimes. As he was driving home late one night, he saw the woman that I had described, but this time next to the cemetery we live near. I have no idea if this is a connection to her or not, but we have never stepped foot in that place. Anyways, he saw this woman, same description as both of our encounters, and passed her. He checked his mirror, and she was still there. He turned around his car and just gave a better look. She was gone. Research. I'm not into horror films, or really anything scary for that matter, but I have done some research since my encounter. But this is definitely a new field for me, so any advice would be great. The website that tells about ghosts in our area of Alabama, and turns out I live near an old iron mill. And to sum up the short story, this woman and her child were killed by a fallen chimney about 1 minute from where I live. She seems to be sighted from time to time, and she's labeled as a stalker, or that's mostly friendly or doesn't hurt anyone, but I have no idea, to be honest. Seeing things as I wake up. But it's something that's never happened to me in 27 years of life, and I would love to hear thoughts or even similar stories. So to preface, me and my boyfriend lived in a house where two previous owners have unfortunately passed away in, the second being his dad. We moved in after his passing to keep the house in the family. I've had small stuff happen from time to time in the 2 years we've lived here. Like the first 2 months we lived here, it was freezing all the time in the house, and I usually run warm and don't get too cold easily. I thought I saw my lampshade move on its own. A light I swear I turned off is on again later. About 6 months ago, I remember waking up in the middle of the night to turn over and face my boyfriend. I wrap my arms around him, open my eyes, and I see what looks exactly like his father standing over my boyfriend's side of the bed. I couldn't see features, but as if a man was truly above our bed with his father's hair and his father's height and build. It took everything in me not to scream, and I'm surprised I didn't wake up my boyfriend with how bad I jolted and gasped. My eyes adjusted and realized I was looking at a poster that we have on our wall of some big dragon animal. I shook it off, but truly never knew if what I saw was real. Never happened again. But last week I was facing the other way, woke up to what I thought was a scary little girl who looked like a doll with button eyes. But a heartbeat shifted back into my dresser. That one woke my boyfriend up since I screamed and jumped over to him. I want to understand why this is happening. So again, I'd love thoughts. Children running in the hallway for years. My wife and I had a repeated unexplained experience over several years. Usually late at night and quite often, just as we'd gotten into bed, we would hear what sounded like children running up and down our corridor. Of course, we had none. This was 10 plus years ago. The house we were in was built in the 80s and had been renovated in the mid-2000s to include an extension of a large living room, an extra bedroom, and an ensuite. This joined the rest of the house by a short passageway, a room away from our bedroom, mind you. The sound would sometimes begin in the middle of the night, and one of us would just wake the other. For me, it was with a sense of confusion and creeping fear. It clearly sounded like someone small and light, maybe two of them running up and down the hallway that joined the original house and the extension. We would sit up in bed and listen for minutes on end. And then, as if turning and running back up the hallway. In my memory, I can feel the hair on the back of my neck sticking up while listening to it and staring wide-eyed at each other through the dark in utter disbelief at what we were hearing. And of course, any investigation would reveal only silence. As soon as you would take a step toward the hall, the noise would stop. This happened so often it stopped being a surprise. My wife told me a story tonight, which is what prompted me to post this for the first time. That one weekend while I was away, the noise was so loud and persistent that she had to shut the door just to sleep. The house had apparently only had one owner previously. Nobody had died in the home. A fact which was independently researched by the owners after we told them. The owners were both in the police force and had the means to confirm those type of queries. It's something we talk about today over a decade later, and we're just as confused now as we were back then. Spooky experience in an old Belgian hotel. A colleague and I attended a seminar in Belgium. We were billeted in a hotel housed in a building from the 19th century. While the interiors had been modernized, they retained the old facade of the building, lending a lot of character to it. At the end of the busy first day, my colleague and I went to the back room to rest before joining the other participants for a night out. I went to the bathroom to freshen up, while my colleague started dozing off in his bed. I'd been in the bathroom for 10 minutes when I heard blood-curdling screams coming from the bedroom. I ran outside to see what was happening. Found my colleague having a nightmare. I shook him vigorously to wake him up. When he did wake up, I asked him what he dreamt of. He said he had a very vivid dream where he saw several children huddled together on the side of our room. They looked like they were dressed from another era. They looked frightened. A European nun then walked in and pressed her hands tightly around his neck. That's when he started screaming. We dismissed the nightmare as a result of jet lag or exhaustion. The following morning, when we were having breakfast at the hotel restaurant, we asked the waiter what the building was previously. Apparently, the building was initially a convent and then was transformed into an orphanage run by nuns up into the 1980s before it was abandoned and then later converted into a hotel. We got goosebumps after hearing the story. After recalling his nightmare, we thought maybe it was not really a nightmare. Instead, he had a ghostly preview of the hotel's past. I think a demon is attached to my mom, and it has controlled her life. This is not just an experience. This has been my whole entire life. Let's go back in time to when my mother was a young girl. My Nana, her mother, had gone over to a friend's house to have a night of drinking. There were plenty of kids fooling around and deciding to go into the house and explore, as kids do. They came across bones, lots and lots of animal bones and goat heads that she had been touching them. Went inside to show everybody, but they had just shrugged her off. That night, her and my Nana had crashed out in the lounge on the floor on the mattress. My Nana awoke, looked over at my mom, and standing there was a very tall black entity with a male statue. Perhaps stature. Its head bent down, just staring at my mother. She believes this is where it all began. Now to when I'm alive and my siblings and our life took a turn. We had moved a lot during childhood, but every single house we lived in, we encountered a very demonic presence within it. From slamming cabinets to laughing in the middle of the night, banging on the front and back doors, objects being thrown, shadows under doors, hooves walking down the hallways, names being called, beings pushed, being hurt physically with starches. I think they mean scratches. Hair being pulled, sounds of bells, and never without a doubt the feeling of being watched. Still to this day is active, but still moving out of home. Nothing has happened in my own home, nor a sibling. Well, it's a big sentence. It's still to this day is active, but since moving out of our home, nothing has happened in my own home, nor my other siblings' home. Only when we return to that house where my mom lives. We've even caught a photo of my mom sleeping on the bed with the wardrobe open and a demonic face was in there just watching her. I've always wanted to reach out and contact this spirit of whatever the hell it is, but I know that's the most dangerous thing I can do. I'm worried for my mom and what may happen to her. Just know that it wants something.